A small beggar saved a millionaire who was crossing the street without paying attention and gave her life in his place. When the girl said what she wanted in her last breath, the millionaire broke down in tears. Little Ivy, a child in tattered and dirty clothes, trembled as she crossed the glass doors of the restaurant. Her feet dragged slowly, her thin hands clutching her hunger-aching stomach, her tired face that of someone who didn't know what a meal was for days. The surrounding environment was crowded, and people talked and ate carelessly, without noticing the girl trying to remain invisible. Each averted gaze, each disapproving grimace at seeing her old clothes and skinny body, was like a silent punch. "Please, can someone pay for a plate of food for me? I'm very hungry. I'm feeling weak. Can someone at least give me a spoonful of food?" she whispered, weakened by the hunger that tormented her as she gathered strength to ask. The restaurant owner saw her and, without a shred of compassion, marched towards her, his steps firm and heavy. He was a tall and stern man with a face that didn't disguise his impatience. When he got close, he raised his voice bluntly. "This is no place for you. Do you think the customers want to look at that while they eat?" he said, pointing at her as if talking about an object. Ivy lowered her head, feeling the words like knives, but tried to respond with a weak voice, almost begging. "I just wanted something to eat." The man raised his hand, interrupting her abruptly. "Look here, nobody owes you anything. Get out before I drag you out the door, understood?" Ivy shrugged her shoulders and took a few steps back, her eyes burning with shame and hunger. As she backed away, she felt the weight of the gazes around her. Some people laughed discreetly, others raised their cell phones, and some averted their gaze, clearly uncomfortable with her presence. Ivy felt even smaller, a human rag amidst that abundance, and, above all, she felt weak from hunger. She looked around, but no one had the slightest intention of helping her. She felt her face burn, but she wouldn't give in. She wouldn't let them see her pain. "For they can't even imagine what it's like to be hungry," she thought, trying to hold back her tears and keep her head up. While Ivy tried to find a less visible corner, an elegant waitress crossed the room with a hot bowl of soup in her hands. The smell of the food was irresistible, and Ivy's stomach growled loudly, making her feel even hungrier. The waitress looked her up and down, her eyes full of disdain, and slowly approached as if Ivy were a stain on the floor she didn't want to step on. Without any remorse, she gave her a light nudge with her foot, making Ivy stumble. In a calculated gesture, the waitress bumped into her, spilling all the soup over the girl, who froze as she felt the hot liquid drip down her dirty clothes and thin skin. The soup burned, but the pain of being humiliated was greater. "How clumsy of me," the waitress murmured, smiling as she walked away without a shred of regret. Muffled laughter arose around, and Ivy tried to swallow her tears. Sorry, I just wanted a little food," she murmured, lowering her head. The floor around Ivy was covered with the remnants of the spilled soup, with small pieces of vegetables scattered, and she fell to her knees, her trembling fingers trying to gather what she could. The customers watched with curiosity, some with contempt, and many still with their cell phones raised, recording every moment. She tried to grab a piece of potato, which rolled away from her thin fingers. "Look at that. What a spectacle. Someone should charge for this," someone laughed, eliciting guffaws from the others. Ivy pressed her lips, swallowing her pride. "I just wanted a little food. That's all," she thought, feeling her face burn with shame. The cold floor hurt her knees, but Ivy insisted on picking up what she could. Her thin fingers tried to grab every piece of the soup, mixed with the tears that fell without her being able to contain them. She looked around, seeing those faces that ignored her, or worse, laughed at her pain. Nobody knows what I go through," she murmured softly, more to herself than to anyone, but unable to convince herself. In the midst of that scene of humiliation, a small child sitting close to Ivy watched the scene with curious eyes. "Mommy, why is she crying?" the little girl asked with an innocent and curious voice, but her mother quickly turned her daughter's face away and replied firmly, "Don't look at that, dear. It's not our problem." Ivy felt her chest tighten, as if the little dignity she had left was crushed right there under that look of disdain. "I just wanted to be like them, just for one day. One single day," she thought, her vision blurred by tears. The waitress returned, this time with a broom in her hands, and began sweeping around Ivy with disdain, pushing away the remnants of the spilled soup. "You're still here. I already told you no one wants you in here. This is a luxury restaurant, not for dirty people and beggars like you," said the waitress without a shred of compassion. Ivy tried to get up, but her legs were weak and her body didn't seem to obey. "Sorry, I'm leaving now," she murmured, her voice broken and almost inaudible, as she tried to hold on to what was left of her dignity. As she staggered towards the door, the customers' laughter and cruel comments still followed her like a shadow. "Now that's entertainment. Should have charged admission," said a man, eliciting new laughter from those around him. Ivy lowered her head, trying to hold back her tears and mumble something no one would hear. The doors of the restaurant closed behind her, but the sound of laughter and cruel comments still echoed in her mind. She took one last look inside the restaurant, observing those people who couldn't imagine what it was like to live with her pain and hunger. "One day I'll eat well. One day I'll get what I deserve." And with that thought, she went on her way. Ivy left the restaurant with her eyes down, feeling the humiliation still burning on her face. She walked to the square across the street, with her bare and dirty feet, feeling an invisible weight to the world. She sat down on the sidewalk and let her body fall, pressing her knees against her chest. The smell of soup was still on her skin and clothes, now dirty and hardened. She tried to swallow the pain and tears, but they were stubborn and kept flowing. "Why can't people see beyond my clothes? Why am I invisible?" she murmured, watching the movement of the square that seemed to ignore her. As she cried, the girl from the restaurant, the same one who had asked her mother about Ivy, ran up to her with something hidden in her small hands. Looking around carefully, the girl offered Ivy a piece of bread which she looked at with surprise and gratitude. Her eyes, once sad, shone at the gesture. "Here, I couldn't eat it. I thought you might be hungry," the girl whispered with a shy smile, avoiding her gaze as if she were doing something forbidden. Thank you so much. I don't know what to say," Ivy replied, holding the bread like a precious treasure, feeling her heart warm with the unexpected kindness. Ivy was about to bite into the bread when she heard light footsteps and turned around. There, standing around her, were other children, all in conditions as sad as hers. Their dirty faces, tattered clothes, and hungry eyes showed that they all shared the same reality. They looked at her with the same hope and need that she had felt seconds before. Ivy swallowed hard, hesitant, but then decided. "We can share," she said, smiling, as she broke the bread into small pieces and offered them to the others. "It's not much, but it's what we have, right?" she added, trying to hide the sadness and focus on the relief those crumbs could bring. The children, their eyes shining with gratitude, accepted the pieces and ate slowly, savoring each crumb as if it were a feast. One of them, a girl smaller than Ivy, hugged the piece carefully before bringing it to her mouth. "Thank you, Ivy. I don't remember the last time I ate bread." Ivy smiled, even with a heavy heart. "Hunger is cruel, but we don't have to face it alone," she murmured to herself, feeling an unexpected peace in that small gesture of solidarity. After eating, the children thanked her with shy smiles and returned to their usual corners in the square, where they hid among benches and trees. Ivy sat watching them leave, still holding the last crumbs of the bread they had shared. Suddenly she felt a light touch on her shoulder. As she turned, she saw an unknown man who, with a kind smile, extended some coins. He placed them in her hand without saying a word and walked away, leaving Ivy surprised and grateful. She looked at the coins in her palm, imagining what she could buy with that amount. Who would have thought? "Maybe I could even buy some more food for me and them," she murmured to herself, feeling a small joy blossom amid the harsh reality. Determined to use the money to buy something she could share with the other children, Ivy stood up and began walking towards the nearest stall, where she knew she could get some bread. She imagined the children's reaction when they saw more food. Maybe she could even get a whole loaf for each one. "It'll be our feast for today," she thought, holding the coins tightly, as if they were a precious treasure. But as she passed by a pharmacy, she heard a rough voice that made her stop in her tracks. Looking through the pharmacy door, Ivy saw an elderly lady, frail in appearance and with trembling hands, trying to count her coins on the counter. In front of her, the clerk looked at her impatiently, his arms crossed as if he were wasting time. "Ma'am, if you don't have the full amount, I can't sell it. This isn't a charity," the clerk said, his voice laced with irritation. The lady tried desperately to count the coins again, but the amount was still not enough. Ivy felt her chest tighten as she watched the scene. She knew what it was like to need help and see all doors closed. She looked at the coins in her own hand, feeling the doubt between using them to buy more food or helping the lady. She needs these coins more than I do, she thought, taking a deep breath and making the decision quickly. Ivy approached the entrance and without fanfare placed her coins on the counter next to the lady's, who looked at her in surprise. The clerk huffed but took the money and handed over the medicine while the lady watched her with teary eyes. "Dear you didn't have to," said the lady with a choked voice, trying to hold back her tears. Ivy shrugged and smiled, as if it were a simple gesture. "Everyone needs help, right? Today it was your turn. Tomorrow it could be mine," Ivy replied, feeling an unexpected joy at seeing the gratitude in the lady's eyes. The lady held Ivy's hand for a moment and squeezed it, as if she wanted to convey all her gratitude with that simple gesture. "You are an angel, my dear, a true angel," the lady whispered, before walking away with the medicine in her hands. Ivy watched the woman disappear into the square, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. An angel. Who would have thought? Maybe I'm just someone who still believes that goodness can return one day, she murmured to herself, smiling slightly. After helping the lady, Ivy sat down again on the sidewalk, watching the hurried people passing by. Amidst the movement, she noticed Sullivan, a man everyone knew around there, a famous millionaire who passed through the square every day at the same time. He had always been a symbol of power and wealth, but that day, something seemed different. Sullivan walked slowly with his shoulders drooping, his face tired, as if he carried a weight that money couldn't alleviate. Ivy watched him with curiosity, wondering what could afflict someone who seemed to have everything. Sullivan stopped to talk to someone, but his voice was low, almost a whisper, and he soon went on his way, his face dull, his eyes distant. Ivy followed him with her gaze, intrigued. How can someone with so much seem so empty? Maybe what he lacks is something money can't buy, Ivy reflected, imagining what that man's world would be like. Seated there, Ivy realized that even with the difficulties and humiliations, she still found solace in small kindnesses, something that seemed distant from Sullivan's life. He passed through the square every day, always in a hurry, always looking straight ahead, but on that day he seemed lost. Ivy sighed, wishing that somehow he could see that there were other riches in life. Maybe he also needs a little help. Maybe even a little love, she thought, as she saw Sullivan's figure walking towards the corner of the street. Ivy remained for a few moments reflecting on that powerful and, at the same time, downcast man. But as she began to get up to leave, the sound of a speeding bus caught her attention. She looked in Sullivan's direction, who, distracted on the phone, was starting to cross the street, oblivious to the danger. The bus was approaching too fast, and Sullivan, without taking his eyes off the screen, followed his path as if he were alone. Ivy felt her heart tighten. He doesn't even realize what's happening. He's about to get run over, she thought, a wave of adrenaline rising through her body. Without hesitating, she began to run. With each step, Ivy felt the weight of responsibility, and the distance seemed enormous, even though he was only a few meters away. "I need to get to him. I can't let him get hurt," she muttered, her eyes fixed on Sullivan's figure, who remained motionless in the middle of the street, ignoring the danger signs around him. The bus driver began to honk, trying to get his attention, but Sullivan didn't react, his head tilted, focused on his conversation. With one last effort, Ivy threw herself against Sullivan, pushing him out of the way of the bus and throwing him towards the sidewalk. He fell with a dull thud, and for an instant his eyes widened as he realized what had just happened. Ivy, however, was caught by the impact. The world spun around her, and the deafening noise seemed to move away as she was thrown to the side of the street, her body hitting the ground hard. Time seemed to have stopped for Sullivan, who looked at Ivy lying on the ground, the shock stamped on his face. He stumbled as he got up and ran to her, the phone falling from his hands, completely forgetting his conversation. "My God! What have you done?" Little one, can you hear me?" Sullivan asked in despair, his voice trembling as he knelt beside her. Ivy slowly blinked, her eyes starting to close, and he held her face with both hands, as if he wanted to prevent her from passing out. "Stay with me. You can't leave me now. I need help. Someone help," he shouted, looking around. The people passing by started to approach, some with shocked expressions and others whispering among themselves. Some quickly called for emergency services, while others just watched, hesitant to get involved. Sullivan, still crouched, tried to make Ivy keep her eyes open. "Don't close your eyes, yeah. Look at me. You saved me. You can't leave me here now. I'll never be able to thank you enough," he murmured, his voice laden with fear and remorse. Ivy blinked, still conscious, but the fatigue seemed to drag her into a deep sleep. She tried to focus on Sullivan's voice, which kept calling out to her, and gave a weak smile. I'm okay, just tired," she whispered, her voice weak but feeling that her words didn't have the strength to reassure him. His image seemed blurred, as if she were seeing him through a veil, and it became increasingly difficult to keep her focus. Sullivan, seeing her lose consciousness, became desperate. "Don't do this to me, please, stay with me. I don't know what to do." "Someone is coming to help," he said, as if trying to convince her that she just needed to hold on for a few more seconds. "You're strong. I know you are. Look at me," he pleaded, his voice choked with panic. Ivy felt her head spinning, and each word seemed to come from far away. She tried to answer, but the fatigue enveloped her like a heavy blanket. It's all right," she murmured, with no strength to say anything else. The faces around her blended together, and she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a strange relief in finally resting. "Stay with me, please," she heard Sullivan's voice again like a distant echo, and thought about how he seemed so fragile, so human, like she had never imagined. Sullivan held her hand tightly, his eyes full of tears as he looked around, as if every second was a torment of uncertainty. "I don't know your name, but please, you can't leave me like this. You saved me, and I need you to stay here so I can thank you, so I can help you somehow," he continued, his voice now lower, almost a whisper. Some people tried to reassure him, saying that the ambulance was on its way, but he didn't seem to hear, trapped in the anguish of seeing the person who had saved him in that state. "Hold on, they'll be here soon. You'll be all right." "You have to be," he repeated, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. My name is Ivy, sir." Sullivan kept holding Ivy's hand, not letting go, kneeling beside her as the crowd approached and the ambulance siren still sounded distant. He tried to keep her eyes open, fighting against the weariness that was overcoming the girl. She blinked slowly, as if the effort to stay awake demanded a strength she no longer had. You need to stay with me, little Ivy. Is there anything I can do for you? Anything you want me to do when you get better? I have to repay you for saving my life," he asked, his voice heavy with anguish, desperately seeking a way to keep her conscious. Ivy opened her eyes with difficulty, feeling her face burning, and Sullivan's words echoing like a promise. "What do I want?" she murmured, as if reflecting on something very distant. Her voice was an almost inaudible thread, but she gathered what little strength she had left to answer. "I want you to feed the children in the square, so they don't go hungry," she asked, her voice laden with a simplicity and sincerity that made him freeze for an instant. Sullivan felt the impact of those words, and his face contorted. "The children? In the square? You don't want anything for yourself, only for me to give them food," he repeated, barely believing the request he had heard, as a lump formed in his throat. Tears began to stream down Sullivan's face, who, until then, had always thought that money solved everything, but now found himself powerless in the face of that little life he was trying to hold on to. "Yes, sir, so that they have a little more than I did," Ivy whispered, her eyes trying to focus on him, but the weakness making it increasingly difficult to stay present. Sullivan wiped the tears with his free hand, trying to prevent her from seeing his despair. "I will, I promise. But you have to stay with me. I need you to hold on until the ambulance arrives. Understand? Tell me something you like," he said, trying to distract her so he could keep her awake and, at the same time, trying to sound firm, but his voice was trembling. Ivy only hinted a slight smile and murmured softly, "The children need someone to take care of them, and I've done my part. The girl's voice failed as if she were saying goodbye. "Please, I beg you to give them food. Their stomachs hurt. That's all I can ask for," the girl implored. Sullivan held her hand tighter, feeling the despair growing as he saw the girl so close to giving up. No, you haven't done everything yet. You need to help me understand. Please, stay conscious, girl. Show me how, he begged, each word laden with a guilt and pain he had never felt before. He took deep breaths, trying to stay calm so she wouldn't notice the panic in his eyes. The sounds of the ambulance finally drew closer, and the paramedics jumped out of the vehicle in a hurry, pushing the crowd aside to clear a path to Ivy. Sullivan didn't let go of her hand, even when they knelt down to examine the girl. She needs to get to the hospital as soon as possible. Her condition is critical, she won't survive, one of the paramedics warned, and Sullivan nodded with a quick nod. I'm going with you, I won't leave her alone, he said, determined, not even bothering to ask if that was allowed. Little one, you'll be okay, I promise, he whispered, trying to sound confident, but his voice still trembling. Sullivan got into the ambulance beside Ivy, holding her hand as the paramedics performed the first aid. The girl was unconscious now, and he looked at her pale face with a concern he never thought he would feel. Why did you do that? Why did you risk your own life for me? He murmured, as if expecting an answer he knew wouldn't come. He felt powerless like he had never felt before, in the face of that girl he barely knew but who seemed to carry a strength greater than anything he knew. I would do it for anyone, sir. My mama used to say that the kindness we do is what we leave as a legacy in the world, she answered in a weak voice, making the millionaire cry even more. The ambulance arrived at the nearest hospital, but it was a hospital for the underprivileged, and Sullivan rushed out, carrying Ivy in his arms. Upon entering, he was surprised by the precarious conditions of the place. Lines of people waited for care, while staff members rushed around but unable to attend to everyone. I should have come with my driver. I should have done this another way, he lamented in a whisper, feeling the weight of his decision to walk alone to feel more independent. Now the choice seemed insignificant, and all that mattered was saving Ivy. A doctor came to attend to them, but his tired demeanor showed that conditions at the hospital were difficult. Her condition is critical. We'll take her in immediately, the doctor said, instructing the nurses to put Ivy on the stretcher. Sullivan walked beside her, not letting go of the girl's hand, and as he found himself in that environment, his panic grew more and more. I'll pay for whatever is needed. I just want them to save this girl. I don't care about the cost, just tell me what needs to be done, he stated, hoping his words would solve everything. The doctor looked at him for a moment, almost with pity, and shook his head. Sir, this hospital is partially on strike. We're short on resources and staff. I'll do my best, but she's in a very delicate state, and we don't have the proper equipment here, he explained, his voice firm, but with a touch of resignation that left Sullivan desperate. It can't be. Then transfer her somewhere else. I'll pay for the transport, the hospital, everything. She needs care now, he insisted, each word coming out as a desperate order. The doctor observed him for a moment before responding, his face serious and cautious. I understand, sir, but in the state the girl is in, if we try to transfer her, she may not survive the journey. She needs immediate care, but here, our capacity is limited and with resources also limited, he explained, as the words sank into Sullivan's mind like a sentence. He looked at Ivy, seeing her fragile face, and felt the weight of reality. Then do what you can, for God's sake. You can't leave her like this, he pleaded, desperation showing in every syllable. Sullivan couldn't take his eyes off Ivy, her face wet with tears as the doctor and team rushed to try to stabilize her. He held her hand firmly, as if that could bring some strength, some miracle. Please, you can't leave me like this. I was saved by this girl. I can't let her not survive because of me, he murmured, as if hoping that somehow Ivy could hear him. The doctor sighed, his face marked by the sadness of those who know that limited resources make even the bare minimum difficult. He gave quick instructions to the team, who began trying to stabilize Ivy, adjusting the equipment and administering medications, while Sullivan remained by her side, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. I know you're strong. I know you can overcome this, Ivy. Just keep fighting, he murmured, feeling the weight of guilt crushing his heart. He knew that every minute there was precious, and despair became more palpable with every moment. After a few minutes of trying, the doctor approached again, his expression worried but determined. Mr. Sullivan, we're doing our best to stabilize her, but the resources here are really insufficient. Her vital signs are fluctuating a lot, and in the critical state she's in, the best chance would be immediate and specialized care. And we'll only get that with a transfer to a hospital with better conditions, but I have to warn you that the risks of transportation are great, he said cautiously, observing Sullivan's desperate gaze. Sullivan felt a lump in his throat but shook his head, determined. If we leave her here, she won't survive. So that's it. We're transferring her now to the best hospital in the city. I'll cover all the costs and take the risks, but I won't leave her without a chance to live, he replied, his voice firm but laden with fear and remorse. He knew that, although the transfer was risky, it was the only option left to try and save Ivy. The doctor nodded, understanding the urgency, and quickly gave orders to prepare the ambulance for the transfer. As the team organized, Sullivan remained by Ivy's side, squeezing her hand as if he could pass her some strength, some glimmer of hope. "Please, Ivy, you've been strong up to here, just hold on a little longer," he whispered, his eyes brimming, as he watched the medical team carefully place the girl on the stretcher and prepare her for transport. He got into the vehicle beside her, holding the frail girl's hand as the ambulance moved swiftly through the streets. "You saved me. Now I need to save you. Please just hold on a little longer," he whispered, his eyes fixed on Ivy's serene face. During the journey, the tension was palpable. The paramedics tried to stabilize her, adjusting the equipment to monitor her vital signs, but Ivy's face seemed to grow paler by the minute. Sullivan felt his chest tighten with anguish, and he held her hand as if somehow he could transfer his own strength to the girl. "She's just a child. Just a child. How can she have such a cruel fate?" he thought, the fear growing with every second that passed. Finally, the ambulance arrived at the private hospital, and the doctors quickly took over, taking Ivy straight to the emergency room. Sullivan followed behind, his mind immersed in a whirlwind of panic and regret. "You need to do everything possible. I'll pay whatever it takes, but save this girl," he pleaded with the doctors, as they rushed with Ivy on a stretcher down the hospital corridors. "Sir, we'll do everything we can, but her condition is serious. We need to assess the damage immediately," one of the doctors replied, as Sullivan watched the distance grow between him and Ivy, who disappeared into an examination room. Outside the room, Sullivan felt powerless. He had never imagined himself in that situation, trapped between the desire to do something and the inability to change what was happening inside. "She's so young. This shouldn't be happening," he murmured, his voice almost fading as he tried to hold himself together. He didn't know if he was prepared to lose someone who, somehow, had done something so noble for him. "I will honor your courage, Ivy. Just don't leave me now." After a few minutes, a doctor came out of the room with a grave expression. "Mr. Sullivan, we've discovered that she has a severe internal hemorrhage. We need to operate on her immediately. If we don't stop the bleeding, she may not make it," the doctor explained, as Sullivan felt the ground crumbling beneath his feet. "Then do it. Spare nothing. I beg you," he stammered, feeling his voice tremble with the idea of losing Ivy. The doctor nodded and quickly returned to the room, leaving Sullivan standing there, his heart crushed by uncertainty and fear. Minutes ticked by like hours, every second a torture for Sullivan, who waited outside alone and consumed by a guilt that seemed to crush him. He remembered every detail of that moment in the square, Ivy's weak smile as she asked him to help the children, as if she knew her life was hanging by a thread. "Please hold on. I promise I'll do everything you asked me to. But I need you alive to see it happen," he murmured, running a hand over his face, feeling the tears he couldn't contain. Suddenly the alarm sounded inside the operating room, and the doctors began to move quickly. Sullivan's heart raced, and he tried to understand what was happening. A nurse rushed out and, seeing his expression, stopped for a moment. "She went into cardiac arrest. We're trying to resuscitate her. Please keep hoping," she said quickly before going back inside. Sullivan brought his hands to his face, feeling the weight of helplessness and pain. "She can't leave like this. She still has so much living to do. Ivy, you have to fight." "Please," he whispered, trying to hold on to hope. The room's lights flickered, and Sullivan could see the frantic movement of the doctors trying to save Ivy's life. Each second felt like an eternity, and all he could think about was the promise she had made him make. "You saved me without expecting anything in return. I should have been more grateful. Please don't leave me. I promise to do what it takes to honor your generosity." he murmured, his eyes fixed on the door, desperately waiting for any sign that she would hold on. After a few minutes, the doctor came out, his face worried. "We managed to resuscitate her, but she lost a lot of blood. We need to monitor her internal organs as the impact was severe, especially on her kidneys. They're starting to fail and we'll need to act quickly, otherwise she won't make it," the doctor explained, looking Sullivan directly in the eyes, as if he wanted to prepare him for the worst. Sullivan nodded, feeling his body tremble. "Do whatever is necessary, I'll cover all the costs. Just don't tell me she has no more chances," he replied, his voice laden with fear and pleading. The tension in the ICU was palpable. Ivy was surrounded by machines and wires, each emitting a specific sound, marking her fragile life's rhythm. The heart monitor showed an unstable line, with sudden spikes that worried the doctors and nurses around. The experienced team, accustomed to handling critical situations, now felt the weight of every second that passed without an improvement in the girl's condition. The silence was broken only by the intermittent sound of the monitors and the doctor's rapid orders, while Ivy, motionless and pale, seemed to drift further away. The first sign of deterioration came when her heart rate began to increase irregularly, a sign that made one of the doctors frown and quickly approach. "She's tachycardic. We need to stabilize her before her heart goes into failure," he said, his voice laden with urgency. The nurses around adjusted medications and exchanged worried glances, already anticipating what would come next. The line on the monitor oscillated relentlessly, and Ivy began to tremble slightly, her muscles contracting in spasms that intensified with every second. Suddenly, her body began to violently contort. The first seizure took hold of Ivy, and the doctors acted swiftly, trying to stabilize the situation. "Seizure, adjust the medication dosage now," ordered the doctor, trying to maintain calm as he controlled the attack's progression. The team followed the instructions, each movement calculated, but the situation slipped from their grasp as Ivy's body shook uncontrollably. The alarms on the machines went off simultaneously, a desperate symphony of sounds that made it clear how critical her condition was. The doctor quickly checked the monitor and made a grave expression upon seeing the fluctuation in her vital signs. "We need to act fast or she'll go into shock," he said, his voice lower, almost as if speaking to himself. The monitor indicated a sharp drop, and the girl's face began to rapidly lose color. With each spasm, it seemed her body was battling between life and death, and the medical team was at their limit, without the time needed to act with the calm they desired. "Her heart rate is out of control. She's losing too much internal bleeding," one nurse warned, trying to contain her own tension. The team adjusted more medications, attempting to control the spasms and the dangerously fluctuating blood pressure, but each attempt seemed insufficient to stop the deterioration. Meanwhile, the chief physician did a quick check, and what he saw confirmed the worst. "Her kidneys are failing. She won't be able to process the medications with her renal function this compromised," he stated, exchanging a worried look with the team. One of the assistants checked the data and shook his head in despair. "If we don't contain this crisis, the kidney failures will accelerate. We don't have much time. She needs an urgent donation. She won't survive." "There's no time to look for a donor that fast," he murmured, adjusting the machines in hopes that Ivy would hold on. Sullivan, waiting outside, felt each alarm sounding like a blow to his chest. He kept his eyes fixed on the ICU door, his hands trembling as he tried to control himself. "Please, Ivy, you've been through so much. Just hold on a little longer," he muttered, his face marked by tension and the tears he tried to hold back. He knew that with every second that passed, Ivy's chances diminished. Inside the ICU, Ivy's condition worsened. The doctor in charge looked at the nurses and signaled that they needed to intervene directly on her kidneys to try to save the girl. "Start the procedure to stabilize renal function. We can't waste time," he ordered, his voice firm but with a note of desperation. The team moved around Ivy as if every second was crucial, adjusting the tubes and monitors, while her body continued to show signs of weakness. The doctor felt the pressure of time, and new options were running out. With her kidneys compromised, Ivy grew weaker, and her body couldn't maintain the balance of essential medications. "Prepare the emergency procedure," he ordered, and the nurses began connecting the machines. But even with all their attempts, the signs of kidney failure were clear. and he knew they needed an immediate response from her body for any chance of success. Suddenly, the heart monitor began showing an irregular line, and her blood pressure plummeted. "She's going into shock," one of the nurses shouted, and the team acted quickly to try to stabilize Ivy's heart. Every second was vital, and they worked as if Ivy's life depended on the next move. "Let's keep her pressure stable. Do whatever you can," the doctor ordered, trying his best not to lose control of the situation. Sullivan heard the shouts and alarms from outside, panic growing more and more. He wanted to go in, do something, but knew any intervention could worsen her condition. He clasped his hands as if in silent prayer and repeated to himself, "Please, Ivy, you have to fight. I'm here waiting for you. Please stay with me." Inside the ICU, the situation was desperate. The doctors worked tirelessly, but Ivy's body continued to show signs of multiple organ failure. "If we can't stabilize her now, she won't make it," the doctor commented, trying to maintain hope. They continued their stabilization attempts, but Ivy's frail body didn't respond to the stimuli as expected. Sullivan was sitting in the office, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the door through which the doctor would enter. He tried to control his nervousness as he waited, his trembling hands resting on his knees. Every second seemed like an eternity. The heavy silence and the cold air of the room only intensified the anguish he felt. "She's just a girl. She needs a chance," he murmured to himself, trying to remain steadfast. He knew that any news at that moment would be decisive for Ivy, and he was willing to do whatever was necessary. The doctor entered, with a serious expression that made Sullivan's heart race even more. He pulled up a chair and sat facing Sullivan without beating around the bush. "Mr. Sullivan, we need to be direct. Ivy's situation is extremely critical. She will only survive if she receives a new kidney immediately. However, she needs this kidney urgently, and finding a compatible donor so quickly is impossible. I'm sorry, sir. We will do everything we can to find one, but the chances are most completely unlikely," the doctor began, his voice heavy with the gravity of the situation. Sullivan felt his entire body freeze. The idea of losing Ivy was unbearable. I can donate. So I'm healthy and I can do this for her," he replied, his voice laden with determination and fear at the same time. The doctor hesitated, and Sullivan realized that something was not right. "Sir, the chance that you are compatible with the girl is almost impossible. You have no degree of kinship with her. We can test you, but it would be a miracle if you were compatible, because the odds are against you. I know that compatibility can be a problem, but you can take the tests if you prefer. I suggest that you say goodbye to Ivy," the doctor explained, trying to keep his tone firm. "Sir, I want to make it clear that we can do the test, but don't have any hopes that you will be compatible. The chances are unlikely. Even if you were compatible, I need you to understand one thing. This procedure is not simple. We need to make sure that you are in a condition to donate," he said, trying to avoid an anxious reaction from the millionaire. Sullivan nodded impatiently and was soon ushered in for a battery of tests. Every second felt like torture as he waited for the results, his mind fixed on Ivy, teetering on that fragile line between life and death. "Please, let everything be okay. Let me be the answer," he whispered, hands clasped in supplication. When the doctor returned, Sullivan nearly leapt out of his chair, anxious to hear any news. The doctor, however, was visibly uncomfortable. He looked at Sullivan with a grave expression and said, "Mr. Sullivan, we don't have the compatibility results yet. However, your tests have revealed a condition that we need to discuss." He placed the papers on the table, pointing to some critical points. "You have a serious heart condition. Your heart is overworked, and if you undergo surgery to donate a kidney, there is a very high chance that you may not survive it," he finished carefully. But the message was clear and direct. Sullivan felt the ground open up beneath his feet. The doctor's words echoed in his mind, but he refused to accept them. But that can't be. I feel fine. I've always been healthy. I need to do this for her. I won't stand by if I can do something to help her. Ivy saved my life," he replied, trying to convince himself that the doctor was wrong, but the doctor shook his head, confirming the diagnosis. "Mr. Sullivan, you can't ignore the severity of the situation. This condition didn't appear out of nowhere. it has been developing over time, and with the current stress, it's rapidly worsening. If you have any stress spike, it could be fatal. Sullivan averted his gaze, feeling the weight of the news crushing his hopes. He took a deep breath, trying to process what he had just heard. But if we do nothing, she'll die. If I'm a match, I'm going to donate. I can't leave her like this, he murmured, eyes welling up, trying to find the strength to accept that devastating reality. The truth hit him with a crushing intensity, and the dilemma between saving Ivy and risking his own life was a burden too heavy to bear. The doctor sighed, understanding the situation, but needing to be direct. If you insist on donating a kidney, the risk is extremely high. We're talking about a real chance that your heart won't withstand the procedure. This decision needs to be made with extreme caution, he explained, trying to be as clear as possible despite the weight of the words. Sullivan could hardly believe he was trapped in this choice, but the image of Ivy, so fragile, was stronger than the fear of his own death. Sullivan leaned forward, holding his head in his hands. He took a deep breath, trying to control his racing heart. I can't let her die. She needs me, and I'll risk whatever it takes for that. Tell me, do I have any chance at all? He asked, almost pleading. The doctor hesitated before answering. Mr. Sullivan, any exertion could worsen your condition. The chance exists, but it's minimal, and any distress could accelerate the situation with your heart. Besides, it's even more unlikely that you'll be compatible. Sullivan closed his eyes, feeling a sharp pang in his chest, but the desire to save Ivy was stronger than his fear. Then I want to try. I'll do it for her, even if it costs me my life, he whispered firmly, but with a broken voice. The doctor still tried to convince Sullivan to reconsider, but the millionaire was determined. I made a promise and I can't break it. Ivy needs someone to protect her, and I'm the only person who can do that now. Suddenly a nurse rushed in, interrupting the conversation, and Sullivan knew immediately that something was wrong. Mr. Sullivan, it's Ivy. She's getting worse. She's not responding to the medication anymore, said the nurse, her face etched with concern. Sullivan's heart raced, and he felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if the world was crumbling around him. The doctor watched him with concern, realizing that Sullivan was starting to have a reaction. Mr. Sullivan, please try to stay calm. You can't be alarmed like this. It's dangerous for your condition, warned the doctor, as the millionaire tried to control his breathing, but the pain in his chest only worsened. The news of Ivy's decline had hit him like a blow, and he felt helpless, unable to act to save the only person who had made him believe in kindness again. The doctor's words sounded distant as Sullivan struggled to breathe, his chest tight and his mind spinning with the image of Ivy. He could barely think, but with what little strength he had left, he tried to articulate a sentence. I can't leave her alone, he murmured, before feeling his vision darken and being overcome by the arrhythmia that made him lose consciousness. Some time later, Sullivan slowly opened his eyes, the room spinning around him as he tried to focus on the pale light from the ceiling. He felt weak, as if something had ripped him from reality and thrown him back there, lying and unable to react immediately. The memory of what had happened began to return. Ivy, the tests, the discovery of his own heart condition. He tried to get up, but a nurse by his side gently pressed on his shoulder, indicating that he should remain lying down. Mr. Sullivan, please rest for a bit. We're still monitoring your condition, she said, her voice calm but firm. He took a deep breath, trying to control the urge to get up immediately. How is she? Ivy, did she make it? He murmured anxiously, feeling his chest tighten with uncertainty. The nurse hesitated before answering, causing his heart to race even faster. Sir, she's hanging by a thread. Her condition is critical, said the nurse, her voice low, almost a whisper. Sullivan closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation crushing him. How much longer will she hold on like this? He thought, trying to remain calm, but knowing time was critical. The doctor entered the room, holding a clipboard and with a look of urgency. Mr. Sullivan, I need to discuss something important with you, he began, approaching the bedside. Sullivan stared at him, his eyes fixed, absorbing every word with a desperate anxiety. We ran the tests to check compatibility, and you are, surprisingly to this entire team, you are compatible to donate the kidney, said the doctor, trying to maintain a calm tone. Sullivan breathed a sigh of relief for a second, a spark of hope igniting within him. "So that's it. I'll donate, doctor. I said I'd do whatever it takes," he replied, his voice firm, as if nothing could dissuade him. The doctor observed him for a moment before continuing, his face serious. "Sir, the situation is highly risky for you. I need you to fully understand this before making a decision." Sullivan shook his head impatiently. "I understand the risks, doctor. I know it could cost me my life, but it's a price I'm willing to pay to save her," he said, trying to get up but still weak. The doctor sighed, knowing he wouldn't back down, and proceeded, trying once more to make him reconsider. "The surgery is complex, and with your heart condition there's a high probability that your heart won't withstand the procedure. This is no small risk, Mr. Sullivan. We want you to understand the gravity of the decision you're about to make," stated the doctor, holding his gaze steadily. Sullivan clenched his fists, aware of the danger, but increasingly determined. "I know what's at stake, doctor. But Ivy is dying. She's a child who needs a second chance, and I can't let her go without doing anything," he said, his voice nearly choked by the weight of his words. As they spoke, an alarm sounded in the distance, and Sullivan's heart raced. A nurse rushed in, her expression tense. "Mr. Sullivan, Ivy is having another cardiac arrest. We're trying to resuscitate her, but her condition is becoming increasingly critical," said the nurse, causing Sullivan's world to spin. He felt the pressure in his chest increase, his heart racing as if trying to keep up with the despair consuming him. She can't leave like this," he murmured, feeling the pain intensify. He closed his eyes, struggling to remain calm, but the fear was uncontrollable. The doctor noticed Sullivan's distress and placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him. "Please, sir, don't make any sudden movements. I understand what you're feeling, but we need you to stabilize for the procedure. Breathe deeply," advised the doctor, as Sullivan tried to control his breathing, his eyes still filled with a desperate determination. "Doctor, I'll sign whatever is necessary. There's no time. She needs that kidney, and I'm willing to do this. I won't forgive myself if I don't," he affirmed, taking the clipboard the doctor offered him. With a trembling hand, Sullivan signed the document authorizing the surgery, his determination evident in every movement, even as weakness threatened to overtake him. "I promised her. I promised to save some kids, and this starts with Ivy. She's my responsibility now," he murmured, gripping the clipboard tightly before handing it back to the doctor. The doctor nodded, acknowledging that the decision had been made, and there was no turning back. As Sullivan was prepared for surgery, he felt the pressure in his chest increasing, as if his heart was trying to resist his own will. He felt weak, but the image of Ivy, frail and fighting for her life, was all he needed to keep going. "Just a little longer, heart. I just need you to hold on until she's safe," he thought, trying to focus on his breathing and stay focused, but the fatigue was starting to weigh him down. With the preparations advancing, Sullivan was taken to the operating room, where the team was rushing to adjust the equipment and prepare the surgical center. The doctor approached him as a nurse made the final preparations. "Mr. Sullivan, there's still time to back out. This surgery is an extreme risk for you," the doctor said one last time, hoping he would reconsider. Sullivan looked him in the eye, unwavering. "Doctor, understand, this isn't just a choice. I need to do this. It's the only way to keep my promise," he replied, his voice firm. The doctor sighed but respected the decision, signaling for the team to begin. However, as soon as the final preparations were made, Sullivan felt an intense pain in his chest. The monitor next to him started beeping, and the medical team exchanged alarmed looks. "Mr. Sullivan, stay calm. Breathe slowly. Your heart is showing signs of failure," warned the doctor, trying to control the situation. Sullivan gritted his teeth, trying to ignore the pain and focus on the goal. "Please, just a little longer," he murmured, fighting against his own body that seemed to want to give up. The pain intensified, and Sullivan felt his vision darkening. The monitor next to him sounded an alarm, indicating his heart was failing. As soon as the monitor triggered the alarm, the shrill and continuous sound cut through the silence in the room, filling the environment with a relentless urgency. The medical team around Sullivan exchanged tense glances, aware of the gravity of the situation. The chief physician, with quick steps, approached and placed a firm hand on Sullivan's shoulder, trying to get his attention. "Sir, stop now. Your heart is giving out. You need to calm down immediately. If you keep forcing it, it may not hold up, said the doctor, his voice laden with a seriousness that left no doubt. Sullivan only clenched his teeth, determined to ignore the body that seemed to betray him every second. His breathing came heavy, his chest compressed in excruciating pain, but he refused to give up. I just need a little more. I need to do this for her, he muttered, his half-open eyes struggling to maintain the consciousness that threatened to slip away. For him, every second lost was a threat to Ivy's future, and his sacrifice seemed small in the face of the girl's life value. But the pain intensified with every moment, as if something in his chest was tightening more and more, robbing him of breath and strength. His vision wavered, the world around him blurred as he tried to fix his gaze on the ceiling above, a point of focus amid the chaos he felt. The doctor watched Sullivan's evident agony, knowing that he was not in a condition to continue. He's pushing too hard. We can't risk losing another patient today, the doctor thought, exchanging a determined look with the team. The chief doctor gave a silent signal to the team, who immediately understood and began to disconnect the devices connected to Sullivan to start the kidney donation surgery. Remove the patient from the room. He needs to be stabilized before any procedure, ordered the doctor, his voice calm but firm. Two nurses approached and carefully held Sullivan's arms, who tried to resist, even though his strength was almost gone. No, I can't stop now. We need to continue the surgery. She needs me, he muttered, his voice punctuated by the pain that pierced his chest. Sullivan felt fragile and helpless, his half-closed eyes as he was removed from the operating room. He didn't want to abandon the fight, but his body seemed to have a will of its own, and all he could do was watch the ceiling passing above him, every light and shadow intensifying the feeling that time was slipping through his fingers. Please, just a little more, he thought, his mind divided between the will to continue and the reality that he was at his limit. When the medical team took him down the hallway, they carefully placed him in a wheelchair, adjusting the monitoring devices to ensure he was stable. A nurse at his side checked his vital signs closely, while the lead doctor knelt beside Sullivan, trying to maintain eye contact. Mr. Sullivan, you're in critical condition. We need to stabilize your heart before proceeding with any surgery attempt. This is essential, the doctor explained, his voice grave but maintaining his calm. Sullivan tried to take a deep breath, trying to soothe his erratic heartbeat, as if he himself was on the verge of collapse. It doesn't matter, doctor. Her life is hanging by a thread. You don't understand what this means to me, he whispered, his voice nearly fading from weakness, each word an effort he could barely endure. The doctor held Sullivan's arm, trying to convey some stability amid the tense situation. I understand, sir, but you also need to survive for the donation to happen. We can't risk everything at once. Sullivan lowered his gaze, his eyes welling up, unable to shake the image of Ivy from his mind. He tried to control his breathing, but despair was taking over, and the feeling of helplessness consumed him. She needs me, doctor. She needs to live. I can't forgive myself if I fail her now. And what if my heart? And if I don't return to normal before saving her? How will I be able to forgive myself? He murmured, feeling the weight of responsibility for the girl's life. The doctor watched him, seeing the effort Sullivan was making to stay calm, but knew his strength was at its limit. The nurse adjusted Sullivan's oxygen, trying to stabilize his breathing, while the doctor continued monitoring his vitals, alert to every change. Sir, what you need to understand is that this surgery will only be possible if your heart is strong enough. You have to calm down. You can't overload yourself so much, or you won't be able to save Ivy if you don't have stability now, the doctor said, his voice laden with a seriousness that left no room for doubt. Sullivan nodded slowly, trying to absorb the harsh, cold reality. Still, he closed his eyes, trying to muster the little strength he had left, as if he could somehow soothe his own heart to continue. Then do it quickly. Just stabilize me. I'll do my best to stay calm. I just need you to help me do what I need to do, he murmured, gripping the arms of the chair, the expression of pain and determination clear on his face. He refused to accept that his body could fail when Ivy's life was at stake. The doctor sighed, sensing Sullivan's stubbornness, but he couldn't ignore the severity of his condition. We'll take care of you and stabilize your heart, but you need to cooperate. "We need to keep you calm," he said, exchanging a signal with the nurse, who administered a light sedative dose to help slow his heart rate. Sullivan still hesitated, but he felt the effect of the medication kicking in, bringing a slight numbness that relieved the excruciating pain in his chest. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of each breath as he tried to convince himself that it was just a pause, that soon he would be strong enough to do what was necessary. "Please, let this pain pass quickly," he thought, his face still marked by tension and uncertainty. He knew that every minute out there could be one less minute for Ivy, but he had no other choice but to give in. After a few minutes of monitoring, Sullivan's heart rate began to stabilize slowly, the monitor alarm decreasing in intensity. The doctor watched closely, satisfied to see that the pressure and beats were finally under control. "You need to keep this up. When you're stable enough, we'll try again," the doctor informed him, but Sullivan just nodded, his expression still tense. Minutes later, Sullivan was sitting in a chair in the hospital hallway, awaiting the moment to be taken for surgery. He looked around, watching the movement of nurses and doctors, the distant murmur of patients and families. The wait seemed endless, and he felt the weight of every second as if it were the last. His thoughts were fixed on Ivy, imagining what would happen if everything went wrong. He asked a nurse for paper and a pen, and seconds later, tears streamed down his face as he held a pen and a piece of paper. In the letter, Sullivan expressed everything he had never said out loud, perhaps not even to himself. He revealed his feelings, the anguish he had kept hidden, and the promises that were now part of his life. The pen slid across the paper with difficulty as he tried to contain his emotion. "If I don't come back, at least let her know that my promise was true," he whispered, finishing the letter with a heavy sigh. Carefully folding the paper, he handed it to the nurse waiting beside him to be delivered to his lawyer along with the instructions he had given. Next, Sullivan picked up the phone with trembling hands and dialed his lawyer's number. The call was brief and silent, but its weight was felt in every pause, in every response from Sullivan. He gave clear instructions without going into details and hung up. He looked at the device, knowing that phone call symbolized a farewell. "It's done. Now it's just trusting that she'll be okay," he murmured, letting the phone drop into his lap. A nurse appeared in the hallway and approached him, informing that the medical team was already prepared for the surgery. Sullivan nodded, trying to gather the little strength he still had, and stood up slowly. But before going, he asked to see Ivy one last time. "I just want to see her, even if just for a moment." "I promise I won't take long," he asked, his voice soft and tired, and the nurse led him to the entrance of Ivy's room, where he could observe the girl lying pale and frail. He approached Ivy's bed, feeling his heart race. With each step, it was as if the world around him disappeared, leaving only the faint sound of her breathing. When he reached her side, he carefully held the girl's hand, as if trying to convey all the courage that was left in his heart. Ivy slowly opened her eyes and, upon seeing him, gave a weak smile, her face connected to machines. "I don't want you to die," she whispered, her voice low, almost like a plea. Sullivan felt a deep pain in his chest upon hearing her words. He forced a smile, trying to convey confidence. "Hey, I'll be fine. We'll do this together and soon we'll be out of here," he lied, trying to convince himself more than her. He knew he wouldn't survive, but he couldn't let her feel afraid. "Just trust me, little one. I promise I'll do whatever it takes," he said, squeezing her hand. Shortly after, Sullivan was again led to the operating room, his face pale and his features exhausted, but his eyes still carrying determination. He knew this was his last chance to do something for Ivy, so he did what he could to remain calm during the initial procedures. The doctors around him adjusted the instruments and prepared the equipment, focused on the complexity of the procedure they were about to perform. The looks exchanged between the team revealed the tension of the moment. Everyone knew they were dealing with an extreme situation, and the margin for error was minimal. "He needs all the strength he can muster, the chances of him, and hers are against us. So let's do this quickly, and we can't make any mistakes. We have to be perfect because everything will be against us now," murmured one of the doctors, adjusting the surgical instruments with precision. While Sullivan was being prepared for surgery, Ivy was in another room, connected to a series of machines that monitored her increasingly weak vital signs. The medical team knew that both were in critical condition and that the success of the surgery depended on perfect synchronization between the two surgeries, since the risk of complications for both patients was extremely high. "She's getting worse. We don't have much time," warned one of the doctors in Ivy's room, while another adjusted the artificial respiration that was keeping the girl alive. "She won't last much longer if we don't act quickly." The surgery began, and the team moved in silence, the sound of the equipment being the only thing filling the room. Sullivan breathed with difficulty, even sedated, as the doctors made the first incision to access the kidney. The tension was palpable. Each movement had to be precise, every second well calculated. "We'll need to speed things up. His heart isn't responding well," murmured the chief surgeon, observing the monitor showing worrying signs. Sullivan seemed to be on the verge of his limit, and the team knew that any misstep could be fatal. In the midst of the surgery, Sullivan's monitor began emitting an irregular signal. His heart rate oscillated, and the doctor realized that the heart was losing stability. "He's going into arrhythmia. We need to stabilize the heart before continuing with the kidney," warned the anesthetist as the team mobilized to act quickly. The doctors administered medications to try to control the heartbeat, but Sullivan's heart continued to weaken, becoming increasingly erratic. "Hold on tight, Mr. Sullivan." "Just a little more," thought the doctor, adjusting the instruments while closely watching the monitor. In the other room, Ivy was also in a fight for her life. Her body showed signs of extreme fatigue, and the doctors worked to keep her stable until the kidney was ready for transplantation. "Her pressure is dropping. We're going to need more support here," said one of the doctors, his voice laden with tension. The team moved frantically, trying to prevent the worst, as Ivy's signs became increasingly weak. "She won't last much longer. We need to be quick," said another doctor, trying to contain the panic he felt. Back in Sullivan's room, the situation was worsening. His heart began to fail again, and the monitor showed a sudden drop in beats. "He's going into cardiac arrest. All efforts to resuscitate him now," shouted the doctor, as the team mobilized, each one performing their role with precision. The defibrillators were quickly adjusted and applied, but Sullivan's body barely reacted, as if it were giving up. "We can't lose him now, he's her only hope," muttered the head doctor, determined not to let that surgery be in vain. With one last effort, Sullivan's heart started beating again, albeit weakly and unstable. The doctors sighed in relief, but aware that they would need to act quickly. "We are at the limit. Any new failure could be definitive," warned the anesthetist, looking at the monitor with apprehension. The team knew there was no room for error, and everyone intensified their focus so that the procedure could be completed as quickly as possible. "Every second counts," thought one of the nurses, as the doctors continued the delicate surgery. Meanwhile, in Ivy's room, the doctors were in a race against time. The girl's heart showed signs of extreme weakness, and her breathing was maintained only by the machines. "If we don't get the kidney soon, she won't make it," commented one of the doctors, his voice trembling. Ivy was in critical condition, and everyone on the team felt the pressure of a life about to slip through their hands. "Come on, Sullivan. You need to survive," murmured one of the doctors, as if his words could reach the man in the other room. Back in Sullivan's operating room, the team finally managed to extract the kidney. But as soon as the organ was removed, Sullivan's heart monitor sounded a shrill alarm, and his heart began to fail again. "We're losing him. He's crashing," the doctor warned, as the anesthetist tried to remain calm. The resuscitation team sprang into action once more, trying to save Sullivan, who was on the brink of death. "We can't lose either of them," thought the lead doctor, determined to fight until the end. The machines continued to emit warning signals, and the medical team did everything in their power to keep Sullivan alive. The defibrillator was activated again, while the doctors administered medication continuously. "Come on, Mr. Sullivan. We need one more chance," the anesthetist murmured, his voice laden with hope and despair. Finally, after a long and exhausting effort, Sullivan's heart began to respond again, albeit weakly. In Ivy's room, the doctors received Sullivan's kidney and immediately began the transplant. The girl's body was at its limit, and her vital signs were unstable. But the medical team worked with precision, trying to stabilize the organ and restore renal function. "The pressure is still dropping. We need more support," said one of the doctors, as the others tried to control the situation. The operation continued, and every move was calculated. The team focused on saving that young life. However, as the transplant progressed, Ivy's body began to reject the kidney. The monitor next to her emitted a warning signal, and the girl's heart began to fail, leading the doctors to take emergency measures. Cardiac function is dropping. We need to stabilize her or we'll lose her, the doctor warned as the team tried to control the rejection. Ivy's situation was rapidly deteriorating, and her heart was struggling to keep beating. Back in Sullivan's room, the millionaire's heart also began to fail again, as if the final effort to donate the kidney had exhausted his last reserves. The monitor next to him triggered a continuous alarm, and the doctors exchanged desperate glances, realizing they were facing a battle on two fronts. We need to keep his heart working. We can't lose him now, said the chief physician, adjusting the equipment in the hope of stabilizing him. The situation was becoming critical, and the atmosphere in both rooms was one of maximum tension. The doctors on both teams were fighting to save Sullivan and Ivy, but with every second, the vital signs of both patients were becoming weaker. The monitors triggered incessant alarms, a symphony of despair that filled the hospital corridors. And then, in a moment of utter despair, both of their machines began to fail at the same time, their vital signs dropping in synchrony, as if Sullivan's and Ivy's lives were intertwined in one final effort to resist. In the surgical center, the atmosphere was one of unbearable tension. The medical teams in both rooms were fighting with all their might to keep Sullivan and Ivy alive. Sullivan's heart monitor was emitting critical signals, each beat seeming like a countdown, and his weakened heart from the surgery and cardiac condition showed signs of failure. The chief physician observed the situation with an expression of pure despair. "Prepare the defibrillator. We're going to try to resuscitate him," he ordered, as the team moved quickly, adjusting the equipment to give Sullivan one last chance. Meanwhile, in the next room, the doctors were about to complete the transplant on Ivy. The new kidney had been implanted, and the team was performing the final procedures to connect the organ to the girl's circulatory system. But Ivy's pressure was fluctuating, and the doctors knew there was no time to celebrate the progress. "We need to stabilize her quickly. Her body is still in shock and rejection is not impossible," one of the doctors commented, exchanging worried looks with her colleagues. They had reached the decisive point. Her life now depended on how the new kidney would react. In Sullivan's surgical center, the doctors applied the first defibrillator shock. His body reacted with a slight spasm, but the monitor remained with the line oscillating without a pattern. The doctor signaled to the team and applied another shock, sweat running down his face as he tried with all his might to bring him back. "Come on, Mr. Sullivan. You can still fight," he murmured, almost as a plea as he adjusted the defibrillator charge for another attempt. The heavy silence was broken only by the sound of the machine and the sound of the electric shock running through Sullivan's body. After the third attempt, the monitor finally showed signs of a heartbeat, although weak. The doctor took a deep breath, aware that this small victory was temporary. "He's still very unstable. Keep monitoring. We need a miracle for him to get through this," the anesthetist commented, exchanging glances with the team who continued to work tirelessly. The doctors around nodded, uncertain whether Sullivan would have the strength to sustain that rhythm any longer. In Ivy's room, the transplant had been successfully completed, and the doctors watched the monitor closely as the girl's body reacted to the new kidney. Slowly, Ivy's vital signs began to show signs of response. Her blood pressure gradually stabilized, and her still weak heartbeat showed a gradual recovery. "She's starting to respond. Let's increase the medication to help her body accept the new organ," the chief physician suggested, keeping a close eye on the monitor, where each beat was a step out of that abyss. But as Ivy began to show signs of recovery, Sullivan's heart failed again. The monitor emitted a sharp and constant alarm, the sound everyone feared to hear. The chief physician rushed to try to apply the defibrillator again. With each attempt, Sullivan's body reacted with spasms, but the monitor remained a flat line that seemed more permanent with every second. "We can't lose him now." "Not after all this," the doctor exclaimed, feeling the tension rise with each passing second. The team followed the instructions, trying to resuscitate him again, but the response was growing weaker each time. The anesthetist looked at the chief physician, the expression of defeat clear on his face. "Cardiac activity is at the limit. I don't know if he'll hold on," he said, his voice low and almost inaudible. The doctor took a deep breath, reluctant to accept what seemed inevitable, as he tried one last resort to reverse the situation. "Sullivan, please, fight a little longer," he murmured, knowing those words were as much for himself as for the patient he was trying to save. While Sullivan was fighting for his life, Ivy was in a state of apparent calm, her body slowly accepting the new kidney. She was starting to show signs of improvement, and the doctors in the room seemed relieved, though cautious. "She's responding well so far. Let's keep close monitoring and adjust the medication as needed," the doctor said as the team around sighed, still mindful of the pressure of the situation. They knew success was still unstable, but they were doing their best to give her a chance at recovery. Back at Sullivan's surgical center, the situation reached a critical point. The monitor showed a flat line, and resuscitation attempts had no effect. The medical team exchanged glances, aware that his heart had no more strength to react. The chief physician bowed his head for a moment in silence before turning to the other doctors. "Mr. Sullivan didn't make it," he announced with deep regret, his voice heavy with sadness and exhaustion. At the same time, in Ivy's room, the girl began to open her eyes, her pale face now gaining a faint touch of color. The medical team around watched, surprised and relieved to see that she was finally coming out of her critical condition. "Ivy, can you hear us?" asked one of the doctors, leaning in to see her reaction as the girl slowly blinked, adjusting to the dim light of the room. Ivy looked around, still confused and weak, but there was something in her gaze that showed an unexpected strength. The doctor held her hand, sketching a comforting smile. "You made it, dear. You're a fighter," she murmured, as Ivy tried to speak, her lips slightly trembling. But before she could ask about Sullivan, a nurse quickly entered the room, calling the doctor aside and informing her of Sullivan's loss. Ivy, now awake, noticed the sudden silence and the distressed look of the doctors. Ivy, still very weak, noticed the sudden silence in the room and the anguished look that the doctor and the nurse exchanged. Something was very wrong, very wrong. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a faint whisper, and her lips trembled slightly. "Sullivan, where is he?" she murmured, her heart racing and her mind plunged into a mixture of confusion and fear. She vaguely remembered his face before the surgery, the comforting words, the promise he made to her that everything would be okay. He couldn't be gone, not after everything he had done for her. The doctor took a deep breath and approached the bed, exchanging a look with the nurse that seemed to reflect all the difficulty in conveying such a delicate news. Ivy felt the anguish grow even more, and the weight became unbearable. "Ivy, Mr. Sullivan made a great sacrifice for you," began the doctor, trying to keep her tone of voice calm, but the tension in her words was evident. He donated his kidney so that you would have a chance to survive." The news hit Ivy like a blow. At first, the information seemed surreal, as if she were dreaming, but as the doctor's words settled in her mind, a growing panic began to dominate her. And him? He's okay, isn't he?" she asked in a faltering voice, her eyes filling with tears she tried to hold back. The doctor hesitated for a moment, and that pause was enough for Ivy to feel the ground open beneath her feet. "Sullivan. He's alive, isn't he? He had to be okay," she continued, her voice broken, almost breathless. The doctor lowered her gaze, unable to look her straight in the eye, and that confirmed what Ivy most feared. A deep and devastating pain pierced her chest, robbing her of the air and strength she had left. He's gone, isn't he? He gave his life for me," Ivy whispered, her voice trembling as tears began to flow uncontrollably down her face. She tried to raise her hand, but her arms were too weak to accompany her in the despair that overflowed. "He wanted you to live, Ivy. He made this decision wholeheartedly, knowing it would be the only way to give you a new chance," the doctor replied, trying to offer some comfort, but Ivy shook her head repeatedly, refusing to accept it. "No, he couldn't. I would never ask that of him," she said between sobs, her eyes swollen with tears and her chest tight as if the pain would crush her from the inside out. "I just wanted him to be okay, to stay by my side. He shouldn't have done this." The monitors around began to beep irregularly, alerting the team to the severity of Ivy's condition. Her breathing was becoming faster and faster, and her rapid heartbeat reflected the intensity of her emotional crisis. The doctor tried to approach her again, gently touching Ivy's shoulder in the hope of calming her down, but Ivy was inconsolable. I didn't want this. I saw him before the surgery. I saw in his eyes that he really cared about me. It's been a long time since anyone cared about me. I never asked him to sacrifice himself for me, she cried out in a weak voice, but loaded with pain. The sound of the monitors intensified, the heart rate peaks reflecting her suffering. The doctor glanced at the nurse, who promptly began to adjust the oxygen flow and prepare a dose of sedative to try to stabilize Ivy. Ivy, you need to breathe slowly. I know it hurts, but you need to calm down, please. He did this so you could live. He believed in your strength and he wouldn't want to see you suffering like this, said the doctor in a low voice, trying to find words that could at least alleviate part of that pain. Ivy continued to shake her head, sobbing and murmuring through tears. I just wanted him to live. He promised he'd be okay. He couldn't leave me like this, she whispered, her voice broken by her panting breath. Every memory of Sullivan was like a new stab in her heart, and the weight of guilt seemed to sink her into an inescapable abyss. Why did he have to do this? I'm not worth it. He should have thought about himself. I'm just a beggar. He's an important man. I'll never be able to live knowing he's gone because of me. With each sentence, Ivy's condition worsened, the monitors indicating a progressive decline in her vital signs. The medical team around her moved frantically, trying to stabilize the situation, but the pain and despair were too great for Ivy to control. She's in critical condition. We need to stabilize before the situation gets out of control, said one of the nurses, adjusting the medications while trying to soothe Ivy with soft touches on her arm. But Ivy seemed unable to calm down. She clutched the sheet tightly, her fingers trembling and her face streaked with tears, as if trying to find some solace in it, but to no avail. He was the only person who showed he cared, who really cared. And now he's gone because of me, she said between sobs, as guilt and grief threatened to take over every part of her being. I never asked for this. I just wanted someone who wouldn't abandon me, she murmured, as her eyes closed for a moment, consumed by exhaustion and pain. The doctor watched with growing concern, aware that in addition to grief, Ivy now faced the physical struggle against kidney rejection. Her already weakened body seemed to be reacting negatively to the transplant, and the girl's emotional condition only worsened the situation. We need more immunological support to prevent her body from rejecting the kidney, said the doctor, trying to remain calm, but the situation was grave. Ivy, still immersed in her pain, did not notice the actions of the doctors around her. Her mind was lost in the image of Sullivan, in the memory of his gentle smile and hopeful gaze. He was my only chance to have someone who cared, she murmured, her voice broken as tears streamed down her face. Meanwhile, in the operating room, the silence was broken only by the sound of Sullivan's monitor, which displayed a continuous straight line. The medical team exchanged mournful glances, knowing they had lost the one who had sacrificed himself to save a life. One of the doctors, his face marked by exhaustion and frustration, removed his gloves and announced in a trembling voice, "Time of death, 3:42 p.m. The room filled with silent mourning, and each team member seemed to absorb the weight of the moment. Sullivan had become more than a patient. He was the man who had risked everything to give a child a chance. But the lead doctor, who had been leading the procedure, hesitated. He looked at Sullivan's body, still trying to understand how that heart, which had shown such extraordinary strength to resist, had finally given in. "No," he murmured, his voice almost inaudible as he placed his hands on the patient's chest. "I can't accept this. This man did all this to save a street kid. He has a strong heart. He has to have." The rest of the team stopped and watched the doctor, surprised by the determination in his eyes. Some nurses tried to approach, concerned, wondering if the doctor had gone mad. But the doctor raised his voice, steadiness mixed with an intensity they had not seen before. "I'm not giving up on him now. Not after all this," he exclaimed, beginning chest compressions, his hands moving with precision over Sullivan's chest. "He has to come back. He deserves that chance." The team exchanged suspicious glances, some silently questioning whether the doctor had lost his reason. The chest compressions continued, the sound of the manual beats breaking the heavy silence in the room. "Doctor, please. He's gone." "It's better to stop," insisted one of the nurses, her voice laden with concern and respect. But the doctor did not listen, his expression determined as he maintained the rhythm of the compressions. "You don't understand. This man went beyond what anyone would do. He's still here, I know he's here," he exclaimed, ignoring attempts to interrupt him. Time passed, and the team around him began to feel despair and tension grow, the doctor's effort defying any logic or protocol. "Doctor, we need to officially declare the time of death," said one of the nurses, her tone insistent. But the doctor continued, his voice now trembling. "No, he wouldn't give up on her. I'm not giving up on him," he exclaimed, as each manual beat seemed a struggle to bring Sullivan back. It was then that in the midst of despair the doctor did something he rarely did. He closed his eyes and muttered a prayer, the words coming out in a low, hoarse voice. "Lord, I don't remember the last time I did this. I'm a skeptical man, my faith is in medicine, but if there's a chance, any chance, this man deserves a chance. He fought with everything he had. He has to come back. Please, help me save him. Help me." With his head bowed, he continued the compressions, his hands firm and his eyes shining with an unwavering faith. The team around him watched, stunned, some crossing their arms and others averting their gaze, feeling like witnesses to something that transcended medicine. And then, after seconds that seemed like hours, a miracle happened. Sullivan's monitor emitted a faint beep, almost imperceptible but real. His heart began to beat again, first faintly, then with more force, as if some mysterious force was bringing him back. The doctor looked up, incredulous, relief and emotion filling his face. "He's back, he's back," he whispered, barely believing what he was seeing. The nurses around were stunned, some letting out sighs of relief, as the team quickly resumed work to stabilize Sullivan. Despite the return of his heartbeat, Sullivan's condition was delicate. The doctors knew he had returned miraculously, but his state was critical, and he now remained in a deep coma, his vital signs fragile. The lead doctor watched the monitor, trying to contain his own emotions. "He's alive, but he still needs intensive care," he announced, and the team began preparing for the transfer to the ICU. The silence in the room was almost reverent, all aware that they had witnessed something extraordinary. "Thank you," the lead doctor whispered softly in a silent prayer. Meanwhile, Ivy was in the ICU. A nurse hurried back into the room, her expression tired but with a gleam in her eyes. She approached Ivy's bed and carefully leaned in to give her the news. "Ivy, we have something to tell you," she said, gently squeezing her hand. Ivy, still in a state of extreme fragility, looked at the nurse with questioning, hopeful eyes. "Sullivan, he survived. The doctor was able to revive him," the nurse whispered, her voice soft but full of meaning. Ivy was shocked, her heart beating faster, as if a breath of life had been returned to her in that instant. "He's alive?" she asked, hardly believing it, her gaze fixed on the nurse, trying to absorb this news that seemed impossible. The nurse smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "Yes, Ivy, he's alive." "It was a true miracle," she replied, watching Ivy's expression transform, the weariness and sadness giving way to deep relief, though she was still aware of the gravity of his condition. "He did it for you, dear. He fought until the very last moment," the nurse added, her tone respectful, as if she too were honoring Sullivan's sacrifice. Ivy felt a wave of emotions rush through her weakened body, and tears of relief and gratitude welled up in her eyes. "I need to see him. I need to be by his side," she murmured, her voice weak but determined. The nurse hesitated, explaining that the state of both was delicate and that they needed rest. However, Ivy's steadfast gaze, filled with determination, made the nurse reconsider. "Please, he gave everything for me. I need to be by his side now," Ivy insisted, her tone charged with an almost irresistible intensity. The nurse, touched by Ivy's devotion, nodded in agreement. With the help of another nurse, they prepared Ivy to be taken to Sullivan's room. When they finally transferred her, Ivy felt her heart beat faster with every meter she drew closer to him. The room doors opened, and she was accommodated by Sullivan's side, who lay pale and in a coma, the machines around monitoring every sign of his delicate recovery. Upon seeing Sullivan's peaceful face, breathing with the help of the machines, Ivy felt a mixture of gratitude and sadness take over her heart. "You gave me life, but I cannot accept that you leave," she whispered. Drawing as close as her strength allowed, her eyes fixed on him as she gently held his hand. Sullivan, motionless and silent, seemed almost at peace, but Ivy knew an invisible struggle was still happening within him. The nurse approached Ivy and carefully adjusted the wires connecting the girl to the machines. "He is in a coma, but there is hope. Mr. Sullivan has overcome the impossible once before, and who knows, he might do it again," the nurse said, trying to comfort her. Ivy nodded, holding his hand as if it were her anchor. "I know you're there. I know you'll come back," she murmured, allowing the tears to finally flow down her face. Days later, Ivy, having recovered enough to sit by Sullivan's side, spent the hours in a careful and dedicated routine. The ICU room was silent, except for the sound of the monitors indicating Sullivan's still critical condition. She would approach him every day with a book in hand, a volume of simple stories she had found at the hospital. For her, each reading was a way to connect with him, to remind him that someone was still waiting for him. In a soft voice, she began to read one of the stories, hoping that, somehow, her words could penetrate the deep sleep he was in. "This one is about a little bird who got lost from his mother," she began, adjusting herself so she could read better. "He flew so high that he ended up getting lost, but a very kind lady found him and fed him until he could fly again." Ivy paused, observing Sullivan's serene face. "It's how I felt. You helped me fly when I had no strength left," she murmured, her eyes fixed on him, as if expecting an answer that would not yet come. Carefully, Ivy closed the book and held Sullivan's hand, feeling the soft warmth that still emanated from him. "You know, Sullivan, I've been thinking about so many places for us to visit when you wake up," she said, a lightness in her voice that revealed her determination to believe in his return. "There's a beautiful park nearby. I passed by it before coming to the hospital. Maybe you've been there before, but I wanted to show it to you my way." She smiled, imagining the scene, trying to convey all her hope to him. Ivy spent her days by his side, planning every detail of what they would do together. "I'll make sure you try all my recipes, Sullivan. Before my mother passed away, we used to play at cooking together. I think I'm a skilled cook, at least that's what my mother said. The first meal I'll make for you will be a soup, one of those homemade ones, nice and warm, to help you get better soon. I know maybe you've never tasted anything like it, but it will be special. I promise it won't be like the hospital soup. But for that, you'll have to let me use the ingredients in your kitchen, if you don't mind, of course. I promise I'll do my best to make this the best meal you ever taste in your entire life," she said softly, gently caressing his hand. She spoke with such affection that it was impossible not to be moved by the scene. In each silent conversation, Ivy made plans and shared dreams. "We'll go to the park. We'll sit on the most beautiful bench and spend the whole afternoon there, you'll see. I can even tell you a story while you rest," she murmured, her gaze full of tenderness. She imagined each moment with such intensity that she could almost feel the warmth of the sun and the gentle breeze that would blow through the trees around them. "And then, when you wake up, we'll eat popcorn. I'll teach you how nice it is to enjoy the simple things." Between one reading and another, Ivy watched the monitor by his side intently, hoping to see any sign of improvement. Each beep represented her silent wish, a prayer for a miracle. "I think you're just resting to regain your strength, aren't you? Because when you wake up, we'll have so much to do," the doctors said. "That I'll be released soon, but that you'll stay here, probably for many years." "But I don't believe that. I believe in you," she whispered, trying to hide the emotion that overflowed in her voice. The monitor kept the same rhythm, but she kept hope alive. On one of the afternoons, Ivy leaned in close to him, speaking almost as if Sullivan could respond at any moment. "You know, Sullivan, I've always wanted to have a family, and now you're my family. When you wake up, we'll create our own moments together, away from any sadness if you want. You can come visit me on the streets. I'll enjoy having you and showing you the things I like to see in places." She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat as she ran her hand through Sullivan's hair with infinite tenderness. "I promise I'll be by your side, always. If you stay here, I promise I'll come every day. I won't leave your side." The routine became a ritual. Every day, Ivy read a new story, told him about the world outside, and made new plans for the two of them in the future. "Tomorrow, I'll bring another story. I think you'll like it. It's about a girl who finds her way home after a long time. It'll be like our return, you see." She smiled at the thought, hope growing with every word. "We're in this together, Sullivan. You'll never be alone again." One afternoon, Ivy brought a notebook, in which she began to write down her ideas and dreams to share with Sullivan when he woke up. "I'm writing everything down so I don't forget any detail," she explained, as if he could hear and understand every word. "We're going to have incredible days ahead, I'm sure. I'll write everything down, and you'll help me make every dream come true, I promise." Over the days, Ivy began to envision in her mind a life they would live together. "I want to take you to see the city lights at night. I want to show you how they reflect on the lake in the park. It's a view I'll never tire of admiring," she said, describing each scene with affection. She wished those words were like seeds of hope, that somehow they would germinate inside him, awakening him. Over time, Ivy began to read not only the stories, but also her own plans, as if she were reciting a list of wishes they would do together. "I thought about painting pictures with you," she said with a light laugh, her voice full of affection and tenderness. The monitor next to Sullivan followed his steady rhythm, and Ivy never failed to observe it at every pause, as if she expected him to somehow react to everything she said. "I know you might be tired, but just a little more. When you come back, all of this will be left behind," she whispered, her voice filled with love and strength. At the end of a particularly quiet afternoon, Ivy leaned in close to him, as if she were about to reveal a secret. "When you wake up, I'm going to tell you that I would save you every day. Do it all over again, all because you cared about me." She gently squeezed his hand, as if that were the only anchor holding them together in that moment. And then, as she spoke, the monitor next to Sullivan emitted a different beep. Ivy stopped talking, her heart pounding, watching the monitor with wide eyes. The line, once monotonous, seemed to show a slight increase in heartbeats. It was the first response from him since the coma. Ivy, her heart racing and her eyes brimming with tears, leaned in even closer and whispered, "Sullivan, can you hear me? I'm here. I'm waiting for you," she said, her heart full of hope. The signal was faint, but it was a response. Ivy watched every detail of his face, as if any movement, no matter how small, could be a sign that he was coming back to her. And then, when she least expected it, Sullivan's fingers twitched slightly in response to her touch. Ivy held her breath, her eyes wide, and leaned in even closer. "Sullivan, did you move?" she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. She waited, and slowly, as if he were struggling to come back to the surface after a long dive, Sullivan's eyes began to open. The brightness bothered him, and he blinked slowly, adjusting to the soft light of the room. Ivy could barely contain the relief and joy that overwhelmed her. A trembling smile played on her lips as she tried to control her tears. Unable to contain herself, she leaned over him, enveloping him in a gentle embrace, fearing she might hurt him. "You're back, Sullivan. You came back to me," she whispered, tears rolling freely down her face. Every word came out like a grateful prayer, and she squeezed his hand tightly, as if to assure herself that he was really there. Sullivan, still weak, moved his lips slowly, his voice an almost inaudible whisper. "Thank you, my angel," he said, with a faint smile full of tenderness. Ivy laughed through her tears, her heart exploding with joy at hearing those words. He was there, and even amidst so much suffering, he found the strength to thank her, the girl he had saved. "No, Sullivan, I have to thank you. You gave me everything. You gave me life," she replied, emotional, not letting go of his hand. The two remained that way, exchanging glances between tears and smiles, as if the world around them had disappeared. Every second seemed precious, and Ivy knew that this moment was a kind of miracle, the rebirth she had prayed for. "I will never leave you again," Ivy promised, gently caressing Sullivan's face, watching his every expression as if she wanted to keep it forever. Sullivan looked at her with a depth that only he could show, as if he understood how much this reunion meant to her. "You were my strength, even without knowing it," he whispered, struggling against the exhaustion that still dominated his body. "You never gave up on me, did you?" he asked, his smile touched by a gratitude he could barely express in words. Ivy nodded, tears still streaming down her face. "No, I would never give up on you." "And now you'll never have to fight alone again," she responded, holding his hand firmly. She watched him as if he were the center of her universe, determined never to let him leave again. "You gave me so much, Sullivan. And now it's my turn to be here for you," she murmured, as if making a silent promise between them. The room was silent, but the love and complicity between them was palpable. Sullivan was still weak, but he found strength in Ivy's presence, feeling that this return was a rebirth. "I just want you to know. I always knew you were waiting for me. Somewhere, even unconscious, I knew you were here. Ivy, we're going to leave this hospital, and when we do, you will be my daughter. I will take care of you with all my heart. That, even weak, still has enough love to care for a child," he said. And Ivy squeezed her eyes shut, feeling her tears well up, feeling the bond between them grow with every second. Ivy smiled, and even though she couldn't hold back her tears, she laughed softly. "You promise?" she asked, her voice vulnerable. "Of course I promise, little Ivy. Because why would I fight so hard to come back?" "I have to take care of you," he replied. The girl smiled through her tears with emotion and joy. "I made a list of things for us to do when we leave here. We'll do all those things, Sullivan. We'll go to the park. We'll sit under the trees, and I'll make all the soups I promised," she said, laughing lightly as she remembered the promises she had made during the days by his side. "You're going to learn what a good homemade soup is, Sullivan, and I won't take any excuses," she added, feigning a serious tone. Sullivan laughed weakly, his voice soft and tired, but full of love. "I can hardly wait, Ivy. I want to experience everything. Every moment, every promise," he replied, feeling her energy give him strengths he didn't know he still had. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, as if he wanted to absorb her entire presence. As the two continued to share that precious moment, the bedroom door slowly opened, and the doctor entered with a clipboard in his hands, carrying the recent results of both their tests. "You're awake." The doctor smiled, indicating he brought good news, and Ivy turned to him, anxious while still holding Sullivan's hand. "Doctor, he's going to be okay, isn't he?" she asked, her voice full of hope. The doctor looked at Sullivan and Ivy, observing the unbreakable bond that united them, and nodded. "It seems so, Ivy. The tests show that you're both recovering very well. It's truly a miracle that you're both here together," he replied with a tone of respect and admiration for the struggle they had both endured. Sullivan and Ivy were preparing for the most awaited day, the day they would finally leave the hospital together. After weeks of recovery, the doctor had given them the news that they were both ready to continue treatment and care at home. Ivy, still with bandages and a slight weakness, couldn't contain the joy and anxiety she felt. With every look at Sullivan, a mixture of gratitude and hope filled her. "It seems we're finally going to get out of here, Sullivan," she murmured, a smile lighting up her face. Sullivan watched her with a tenderness that only grew, feeling grateful to be able to take her home, now with a renewed sense of purpose. "Yes, Ivy. Now a new life begins for the two of us. We'll finally put into practice everything we planned," he replied, his voice soft but full of emotion. He knew that from that day on, nothing would ever be the same. She was part of his life now, a part he would never let go of. As they signed the last papers and the nurse handed them the details of the necessary care, Sullivan made sure that Ivy would have everything she needed. "Everything is already prepared for you at my house, Ivy. It will be our new home," he said, feeling emotional to offer the girl something she had never had, a place to call home. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude, holding his hand with sincere affection. "I never thought I'd have a home one day. Someone who cared," she whispered, her voice choked up. The nurse, observing the bond between them, smiled affectionately and wished them the best. "Remember to take good care of each other. You two are strong and made it this far together. Now it's time to enjoy this new stage," she said, as she accompanied the two to the exit. As she crossed the hospital door, Ivy felt a gentle breeze on her face, and for the first time she felt truly free. "This is the beginning, Sullivan." "Our beginning," she murmured, holding his hand tightly. When they reached the car door, Ivy hesitated for a moment, looking at Sullivan with a shy smile. "I never imagined someone like me would have a chance like this," she said, looking at the man who had changed her life so profoundly. "You deserve this, Ivy, and everything else you want in life. Now you have someone to take care of you," Sullivan replied with a gentle look. He knew that for her every step was an achievement. The drive to Sullivan's house was silent, but not uncomfortable. Ivy observed the city through the car window, impressed by everything she saw as if seeing the world for the first time. "I never imagined the city was so beautiful," she murmured, admiring the lights and grandeur around her. "Wait until you see everything calmly. We'll go for many walks, you'll see," promised Sullivan, pleased to see her curiosity blossoming. When they arrived at Sullivan's house, Ivy was speechless. It was an imposing mansion, but with a welcoming touch that reflected his personality. She hesitated before getting out of the car, looking at Sullivan for any sign that she should really be there. "It's your home too now, Ivy. You can come in without fear," he said, offering her his hand. With her heart racing, Ivy accepted the invitation and took the first steps towards her new home. Inside the house, Ivy observed every detail, enchanted by everything she saw. "It's all so beautiful, so different from the cardboard I used to sleep on the street," she whispered, her eyes shining as she looked around. Sullivan guided her down the hallway, showing her each room, while she absorbed everything with an expression of fascination. "I want you to feel at home here. All of this is yours too now," he said with a soft smile, seeing her happiness grow with each discovery. In the room that had been prepared for her, Ivy found a comfortable bed and new clothes carefully folded on top. She looked at Sullivan with tears in her eyes, not knowing how to express her gratitude. "You did all this for me. I never imagined anyone could care so much," she said, her voice trembling. "You deserve this, and much more, Ivy." "This is just the beginning," he replied, moved to see her so happy. Ivy walked over to the bed, touching the soft sheets and pillows with an incredulous smile. "I don't know how to thank you. Everything feels like a dream," she said, still trying to absorb the reality around her. "Then enjoy the dream, Ivy. From now on, I want you to be happy, to feel safe," Sullivan replied, sitting beside her and holding her hand. In the days that followed, Ivy began to adapt to the new life, exploring every corner of the house with a smile on her lips. Sullivan watched her from afar, his heart filled with peace as he saw that she had finally found a home. "You're doing well here, Ivy. I knew this place would be special for you," he said, certain that decision had been the best he'd ever made. "I never thought a house could be so welcoming. So mine," she murmured, still amazed at each discovery. Every morning, Sullivan and Ivy would create new routines together. He taught her small tasks and she told him about her dreams and hopes for the future. "One day I'm going to make breakfast for us, Sullivan. It will be the best meal you've ever had," she promised, eliciting a smile from him. "I'm looking forward to it, Ivy. I'm sure it will be unforgettable," he replied, touched by her sincerity. Through conversations and laughter, Sullivan and Ivy shared moments of simplicity and complicity. She was now the family he so needed, and he was the security she had never known. "I don't know what my life would be like without you," Ivy confessed one quiet afternoon, sitting beside him on the porch. "Mine has also changed forever, Ivy, and I would do it all over again for you," he replied, his eyes shining. Ivy's presence brought new life to the mansion. She decorated the place with drawings and small objects she created, and every detail made the house seem more alive. "This place now has your essence, Ivy. You are what was missing for it to become a home," Sullivan said, gently touching her shoulder. "And you are the reason why I feel at home," she replied with a sincere smile. Ivy and Sullivan began to make plans for the future, mapping out each step as a new adventure to be lived. "One day we'll see the world together, Sullivan. I'll show you all the places I've always dreamed of seeing," Ivy said, her gaze distant, full of dreams. "And I'll be by your side in each of those places, because you taught me to dream too," he replied, moved by her hope. At the end of the first month, both had completely adapted to the routine together. Sullivan knew that by choosing to adopt Ivy as part of his life, he had given himself a second chance. And she knew that by receiving that unconditional love, she had found something much greater than she could ever imagine. "We are both a miracle, Sullivan, and together we are stronger than ever," Ivy whispered at the end of another day as they watched the sunset. "Yes, Ivy, this is the true meaning of family," he replied, squeezing her hand. Sullivan and Ivy walked together to the square, the place where their lives first crossed paths. The day was sunny, and the soft light illuminated the square, almost as a sign that this moment was an important milestone for both of them. Ivy looked around, recognizing the corners where she used to shelter from the cold and hunger. Seeing this place from a new perspective, now beside Sullivan, brought her a sense of gratitude, but also responsibility. "It's strange to be here like this, knowing everything has changed," she murmured with a sad smile. Sullivan nodded, understanding exactly how she felt. He knew that the square held difficult memories for Ivy, but it was also the setting for the beginning of a new life for both of them. "Yes, Ivy, but now we're here to make a difference so that no one else has to go through what you went through," he replied, looking around with a determined gaze. He too felt the urgency to transform this place into more than a temporary refuge for the children still wandering around there. As they walked through the square, they began to notice other children, with tired looks and worn clothes, glancing at them with distant curiosity, perhaps with a touch of hope. Ivy recognized them immediately. She knew exactly what each of them felt when they saw someone from the outside looking at their reality. "They are like I was, Sullivan. They're here alone, waiting for someone to notice them," Ivy said, her voice choked up. "They need help. We can't leave them like this." Sullivan stopped observing the children and felt his heart tighten. He knew that for many the square was just a passing place, but for those children, it was all they had. He looked at Ivy and saw in her eyes a determination that he shared. "Ivy, we're going to do more than just give them a meal today. We are going to create a place where they can find safety, where they never have to sleep hungry again," Sullivan stated, his voice full of purpose. They began talking to the children, handing out snacks and listening to their stories. Each shy smile and hesitant word reinforced the decision Sullivan and Ivy had made. "I remember when I received a piece of bread. It was everything to me in that moment. But now I can do more than just give them food," Ivy said, looking at Sullivan with shining eyes. "We'll create something that lasts, something that's more than just today." As they talked, an idea began to take shape. Sullivan looked at her and with a smile suggested, "Ivy, what if we built a place, a center where they could always come, where they would have food, shelter, and even opportunities?" The girl looked at him, her eyes wide, trying to take in the grand idea. "A place for everyone? So that no one else has to go through what I went through?" she whispered, almost in disbelief. Sullivan nodded, feeling the weight of the decision. He knew it wouldn't be an easy task, but he was willing to do anything to change the reality of those children. Yes, a place for everyone, a center where none of them have to sleep outside or go hungry. Where they can be real children, he said, his heart racing with the expectation of the project they were creating together. That same week, Sullivan and Ivy began working on the project. They visited locations around the city, looking for a suitable space to create the support center. Each visit reinforced their commitment, and the idea of helping those children became a purpose that united their lives even more. "It won't be easy, but we'll make it." "I know we will," Ivy murmured whenever she felt the weight of responsibility. When they finally found an abandoned building that could be restored, Ivy was emotional. She observed the site with eyes full of hope, imagining every detail of what it could become. "Sullivan, this is perfect. Imagine. We could have a kitchen, a place for the children to study, even beds for those who need to spend the night," she said as she walked through the empty space. For her, every corner of that building represented a new possibility to offer safety and affection. Sullivan, observing her excitement, smiled and nodded. "Yes, Ivy, we'll make this place a refuge for everyone in need," he replied, determined to turn that idea into reality. He knew the journey would be long, but he was willing to dedicate every effort to the project. It was his way of giving back to the world the love and compassion he had discovered by Ivy's side. The following weeks were intense. Sullivan and Ivy worked side by side, planning and organizing what would become the first support center for homeless children. With each visit, each conversation with professionals and volunteers, Ivy felt her heart warm, knowing they were building something important. "This place will be proof that no one needs to be alone," she said at a meeting with the volunteers. Finally, the big day had arrived. The center was ready to be inaugurated. Ivy and Sullivan were anxious and excited to see the result of so much work. As they opened the doors of the center, they saw the first children entering, with curious and hopeful looks, and felt a wave of joy knowing they were there to make a difference. "Welcome to our new home," said Ivy with a broad smile, welcoming each one as if they were part of her family. Sullivan observed the scene with teary eyes, seeing Ivy shine in that role that was now hers. "You were the inspiration for all of this, Ivy. Without you, none of this would exist," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. She hugged him, moved, knowing that this moment was the realization of a dream that once seemed impossible. Now the center was a reality, and Sullivan and Ivy together were ready to face any challenge that came. Months passed since the opening of the aid center, and Ivy and Sullivan's life had been transformed in a way that neither of them had ever imagined. The square, which was once just a place of painful memories, was now filled with children playing, laughing, and sharing moments that had once been a distant luxury for them. Ivy walked through the center, observing every detail with a smile of pure happiness, enchanted by what they had built together. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the center was particularly lively. Ivy and Sullivan had planned a party for the children, with food, music, and games. The sight of the children running through the decorated hall filled Ivy with genuine pride. She remembered how it all began, the day she herself was lost alone and hungry in the same square, until the moment she and Sullivan met. Ivy looked at Sullivan, who was on the other side of the hall, talking to a group of volunteers. He seemed happy, rejuvenated, as if this new mission had given him a purpose he had never found in business and wealth. When he saw her, he smiled, and she ran to him, laughing, her eyes shining with joy. "Look, Sullivan, the party is a success. I think we've both achieved more than we dreamed, don't you think?" Ivy said, holding his hand affectionately. Sullivan laughed softly and put his hand on her shoulder, pulling her into a warm embrace. "We did, Ivy, and it's all thanks to you. You brought hope to these children and showed me the true meaning of family," he replied, his eyes emotional. This journey had been as meaningful for him as it had been for her, and every child there was a reminder that their sacrifice and dedication were worth it. The children surrounded them, pulling Ivy to play and insisting that Sullivan tell stories. Both spent the rest of the afternoon like that, completely involved, sharing laughter and special moments with the little ones. Every smile, every laugh from the children was a testimony to the transformation that Center had brought. The joy was contagious, and Sullivan and Ivy couldn't be happier. After the party, as night began to fall, the center calmed down, and the younger children were taken to their beds. Some had families to return to, but many remained in the care of the center, where they had safety and comfort for the first time in their lives. Sullivan and Ivy walked through the center, turning off lights and checking every detail before leaving. When they reached the entrance, Ivy turned to the illuminated center and sighed, looking at every corner with special affection. "It's a home for all of them, Sullivan. It's a home for me too," she murmured, moved. He looked at her with tenderness, feeling immensely grateful to have her by his side, as a daughter, friend, and now as the person who meant the world to him. "Yes, Ivy, and it always will be. This center is just the beginning of something much bigger, something we'll build together," Sullivan replied, placing a caring hand on her shoulder. He knew that this mission was the purpose of his life, and being by Ivy's side made every moment worth it. "We have a lot to do, and I know that with you by my side, everything is possible." In the months that followed, Sullivan and Ivy continued to expand the work of the center, offering not only food and shelter, but also educational opportunities, cultural activities, and workshops to help children develop skills and discover talents. For Ivy, teaching those children was a way to repay everything Sullivan had done for her, and every progress they made was a victory. One afternoon, as Ivy was organizing an art workshop, a little girl approached her and with a shy smile offered her a paper. Ivy took the drawing and upon opening it saw that it was an illustration of her and Sullivan, surrounded by children with hearts and smiles drawn around them. "This is for you, Ivy. You're like a family to all of us," the girl said, her eyes shining with affection. Ivy felt her eyes well up and moved. She hugged the girl, holding her tightly. "Thank you, dear. You are also my family," she replied, her voice choked. She looked at Sullivan, who was observing the scene from afar, and they exchanged a knowing smile as if they knew that the shared love between them and the children was the true reason for everything they had built. Time passed, and the center continued to grow, becoming a recognized and respected place in the city. Sullivan and Ivy's dedication inspired many others to join them, and the center began to receive donations and support from the community. Ivy and Sullivan knew they were planting seeds that would blossom for generations. On a morning, while preparing coffee for the children, Sullivan approached Ivy and placed his hand on her shoulder, with a tender smile. "Daughter, have you ever thought about all the dreams we had? I think we managed to fulfill all of them," he said with quiet happiness. "Yes, Father, we did, and with that, I discovered that dreams never end." "We can always dream more and do more," she replied, embracing him affectionately. The two continued to work side by side, strengthening the bond between them and the children more and more. The joy they shared was something beyond words, a sense of purpose and fulfillment that filled them completely. For Sullivan and Ivy, that journey was the true meaning of family and unconditional love. And so, in that center that had once been just a dream, Sullivan and Ivy built a life dedicated to love and generosity, creating not only a home, but a legacy that would live on in every child who passed through those doors. They knew that, as long as they were together, what they had built would be eternal. If you like this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing moving stories almost every day. Don't miss the next amazing narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links that are appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, full of valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.